Hello everyone, and welcome to another yet a little different episode of What We Can't Not Talk About. For those of you who are listening, this episode might sound just like any other episode, and I actually hope that the sound quality you'll get this time is just going to be as good as all our episodes. But for those of you who are watching on our YouTube channel, I think that the difference is quite clear. Today I'm joined live by our guest, Dr. Paul Fortunato, Associate Professor of English at the University of Houston, downtown. Welcome, Paul.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for accepting our invitation. And today it's going to be something between a podcast and a lecture, a conversation. We're going to talk about one of your favorite topics, though. I think, at least, is one of your favorites, which is Oscar Wilde.
Yes.
Before we do that, though, before also I explain why we at the Austin Institute chose to talk about Oscar Wilde, would you like to describe maybe yourself to our audience?
Sure. Well, I got interested in Wilde when I was an undergraduate, and I was taught in my regular undergraduate class that he was a rebel and he was tearing down culture and destroying Western civilization. That was his identity. He was like a figure like Nietzsche, beyond good and evil. And so you read it and you see his life and you see his works, and the picture of Dorian Gray and a kind of amoral character. And I thought, okay, that's what he was. But then I was reading his biography. I was actually in the cloisters in New York City, because I was studying in New York City, and I was reading Oscar Wilde there with my friend, and it went through his life and how he made his big splash on the West End theater, and then he went to jail because homosexuality was illegal in England at the time, and he got out of jail and he went to France, and then he was received into the Catholic Church. And I said, wait a minute, where did that come from? That didn't seem to have any precedent in his whole life. So that kind of led me to kind of do research on him, that there was more going on with Wilde than
so
I was being told.
Your interest in Wilde, I wanted to know more or less, your undergraduate study, graduate studies. I know you're a professor in Houston. But so what I didn't know is that your interest for Wilde traces back to the time. So were we talking about your undergraduate studies?
Yeah, that was a long time ago. That was my undergraduate studies.
Wow, so I think I was correct when I said it's probably one of your favorite topics.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is.
Okay.
No, he's great. I love him.
Well, that's great to know. So you all know that we're really talking with someone who likes what is going to talk about. Now, I should say more, as I anticipated, about the reason why we decided to talk about Oscar Wilde. True, we talk about great books, but then why about this controversial figure? And I think that our audience might remember how a couple of months ago, at the beginning of the year now, we had Professor Truman. He gave a lecture for us at the Salem Center, and also in this very room, we read his book, Strange New World, which I think and hope that some of our audience also has read. So we read it here in this, again, the same room with my young professional reading group that we have here, the Good Life reading group, for a couple of months. And what Dr. Truman does in that book, for those who haven't read it or do not remember, he traces a history of how we got to today's confusion. And it's a history of thinkers and ideas that led us to the sexual revolution. And in doing that, Dr. Truman gives particular weight to the figure of Oscar Wilde. He mentions him as a central figure. And he in particular argues that Wilde is the perfect heir of Nietzsche, of the Nietzschean rebellious thought, as you were mentioning. So he writes that the rebellious Nietzschean impulse is found in three particular aspects of Wilde's life and thought. The first being that the artist is the greatest exemplar of how life should be lived because he self-creates himself, and he does not conform or follow the herd. The second one is that in Wilde, art is detached from any moral code. And then the third one, ethic is just a matter of aesthetics. and just a matter of taste. So now that I am sitting with an expert on Oscar Wilde, and you had started already to mention these points, even though we didn't prepare this, I wanted to say I would like to go even one by one, right? You know, and whether Truman in this case was, you know, is he totally right, or like is it so accurate to say, for instance, that the artist is the man who creates himself, and in being that is the perfect Nietzschean model of the new man.
Right. And I would say that Wilde is making an argument along those lines that you're creating yourself. The thing is, that can be taken in a strong or a weak sense, and I think Wilde was a journalist, so he would say things with a very extreme, an extreme form, but you had to see it in the context of all of his work. And I suspect, I love Truman's work, and I think he's basically right about everything that he's saying in that book, but I think he's missing something on Wilde here. Actually, I do think that Truman's a little bit wrong, and that's I'm going to be careful here because I mean I don't want to take on Truman, but because I think Wilde is right about something, because there's something about the modern world that Wilde wanted to embrace. He wanted to dive into the consumer culture world, and others, and sometimes it's Marxists, sometimes it's Christians like Truman, don't want art and culture to get too entangled in the consumer culture world because it can cheapen it, it can distort it and ruin it, and it does sometimes. But I think what Wilde's insight was that it doesn't have to, and that consumer culture, and we create ourselves to some extent through our consumer culture. What I buy, the fandoms that I'm a fan of, the styles of fashion that I follow, I'm creating myself. And a young person will kind of like choose their styles of music and their fandoms and even their religious tastes. And those things, you are creating yourself. That's the way, and that's what I'm saying by a weak sense of self-creation. Obviously, no one creates themselves. I mean, you know, if you believe in God, God creates us. We come out of our parents. I mean, like, we come out of a culture, a language, all that stuff. We're totally predetermined by, and that's fine, and that's good. No one creates themselves in that sense. But yeah, and I think Wilde was onto something when he's saying that we are creating ourselves through our consuming practices and habits. And anyway,
I think I understood what you meant, and so at this point you would say that the kind of self-creation that Wilde is talking about is not that radical and absolute self-creation that Nietzsche would be predicate. Look, like it's not self-creating everything.
No, right.
Okay. Which I think, based on what the other things that I know about him, I think it does make sense, because he does sound like that there is a difference, for instance, in Christian language between, we could call it what we would call sin, or in non-Christian language you could call limit. And it's one thing to say there are no limits, and to one saying it's like, I'd rather cross this line. You know, like you're still admitting that there is a line. Right. So you would argue he considers and what do you mean by consumer culture? Like,
so consumer culture, like the things that we buy and that we become, they also kind of shape our identities. I mean, if I can back up for a second, in the more traditional cultures of the ancient world, the medieval world, who was governing culture? The state, the religion, you know, Islam or Christianity or Buddhism. They would kind of legislate and figure out, like, here's how we're going to make culture, here's what are the artworks, here's how people are going to make music and then be influenced by it, the rituals that we're going to do. In the modern world, we're in a multicultural situation. There is no one dominant religion. And so consumer culture is very involved in all those things of creating works of art, like the things we decorate our houses with, the things we decorate ourselves with, the fashions that we follow. So all that's consumer culture. And I mean, like becoming a fan of a show, a TV show. I'm watching The Rings of Power right now, the Lord of the Rings series. You know, and then you become a fan, and then you have a community, and it does kind of shape your identity and your community. So all of that is what I mean by consumer culture.
I completely understand. And so you would say, you know, taking it away from Wilde, that you would argue that it's extremely important if we wanted to transform the culture to actually get very involved with the consumer culture.
Right.
Not to decide to do the opposite.
Exactly right. Yeah. And you know, I'm in an English department, and the reason I'm kind of excited about Wilde even today, like I've sort of come back to him. I wrote my book in 2007, so it's been a while, but I'm kind of realizing like there's this untapped work in Wilde on thinking about the power and the productive, positive power of consumer culture, as well as negative power, because it can be destructive. That has not been talked about, and English departments have completely ignored it. Why? I mean, partly because we're sort of dominated by Marxist criticism. I mean, that's sort of the kind of background of a lot of critical work in the English departments. So it has no interest in consumer culture, or it just sees it as bad. And so Wilde, I think his theories, and others besides Wilde, I mean, I get into Tolkien actually, as an example of someone who's deeply involved in consumer culture and the positive possibilities of working in consumer culture, because there is no one dominant religion or one dominant kind of arbiter of taste and culture. So you've got to dive into that world and get your hands dirty, so to speak.
Yeah, I think on a personal level, I completely agree with you, but I think that also at a level of idea, it makes a lot of sense. The other points that in Wilde, art is completely detached from morality, or that ethic is just a matter of aesthetics. Would you agree that that's the case?
So he says things that play with that idea. And when he wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is this big novel, he was immediately criticized for being immoral, and so because he does play with morality, and there's an amoral character who kind of shapes this younger character, which is Dorian Gray, and influences him into doing all these bad, evil things, including like murdering people and destroying people's lives. And Wilde responded to that criticism by doubling down on things, and he wrote a preface to his book, and he says, all art is amoral. Or I think all art is immoral. Like, it's like deliberately against morality. And I don't think he literally meant that, but he wanted to like kind of defend himself. So he was kind of in that specific moment that he wrote that. It wasn't that he was thinking, because if you read the novel, it's completely moral.
That's what I wanted to talk about that book a little later on, but like let's talk about it now. I mean, I read it as a teenager, and I found it profoundly, it was a great teaching.
Yeah, it's a great book because it shows that the person who tries to live an amoral life, a kind of Raskolnikov, who is like, okay, there's no like truth, there's no good and evil, so I'm just going to do what I want. And then at the end, so Dorian Gray has done all these things, and okay, just to kind of explain the story.
Yeah.
There's this magical thing in the story. It's kind of fantasy, magical realism, where someone's done this beautiful painting of him, the picture of Dorian Gray, and he's this beautiful young man, and he's looking at the painting, and he's thinking, wow, that painting's going to stay young and handsome, and I'm going to get old and ugly, and I wish I could trade places with that painting, and I could stay young and healthy, and the painting would bear the marks of age and sin. And he got his wish. So then all of a sudden, the evil things that he does, like when he murders somebody, the painting gets blood on its hands. Or when he destroys this woman's life by like jilting her, like you see this evil smile on the painting. And so at the end, he's thinking, I've done all these things, but there's only one thing that's going to get me in trouble. This painting. I know, I'll destroy it, and then no one will ever catch me. So he stabs the painting, and as he stabs the painting, you hear a shout, and then his servant goes up the stairs because he's in his attic, very Freudian, the servant goes into the attic and sees Dorian Gray on the floor. He's stabbed himself, and he's old and wrinkled, and his painting is young and beautiful again. And so it shows when you try to destroy your conscience, you destroy yourself.
Yeah, and it ends up in suicide. I mean, it's a perfect, I don't know, I think it would be a lesson for, it is the story that you tell kids, for the morality of it.
It's completely moral, right, yeah.
And maybe there is something also in the provocative preface, to the book, All Art is Immoral, that plays. You sent me I got a version of your book recently. It was only a week ago, so I must say I haven't had the time to read it all. But like the book is about the modernist aesthetics and the consumer culture and Oscar Wilde. And we can link to the book too in this episode, because there might be people out there that are a lot more interested in this than the general conversation that we're going to have now that everyone can enjoy. But when you mentioned it in the preface, it's a topic of conversation, especially also in this room with the people that come here. We argue a lot about books and about music and about movies, wondering whether they should give us a message, right? Mm-hmm. And our position is usually no. Mm-hmm. They're meant to provoke or make you think. So this all art is immoral. I mean, it sounds like the perfect, introduction for anyone who doesn't want to be told what to think, but just want to make up his mind and figure out whether Dorian would be really happy in living the life the way it did or not.
Right. Well, and so there's 2 points I want to make, and one is that the picture of Dorian Gray, the novel, has a very strong moral. So sometimes he broke his rule and he had a strong moral. Other times he was more circumspect. He would create a story or a work of art that didn't have a clear moral. Like Salome is a kind of, you can sort of tease a moral out of that, but Salome is a play about Salome, the woman who asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter, and she danced for her uncle / father-in-law, Herod. And there's no clear moral in that play. So sometimes the work of art it's just a kind of experiment by the artist. It's an attempt to create something beautiful and something that's of cultural value that people can contemplate, and it shouldn't be preaching to you. And that's what I think Wilde was objecting to, was art that was just too preachy and do the right thing. A work of art doesn't have to have that. It has its own domain, which you should respect. And I think Wilde was correct, and that's what I think Wilde was trying to say when he said that art shouldn't have a teaching function primarily.
Yeah, I could relate it to a recent movie that is in the theaters, The Whale.
I haven't seen it yet.
Well, that's how I felt. I didn't. The beauty of a movie like that to me is that you can come out of the theater with your own ideas that you had before or change, but it's not the movie that is going to tell you what is right and what is wrong about the things you're watching. Anyway, this for anyone who wants to go to watch the movie, I just made a great ad. I wanted to actually with you, to discuss Truman's view about Wilde. I wanted to talk about the picture of Dorian Gray and how, what you made of how the life of, what we see in the pictures, that a life of sin corrupts you. Mm-hmm, it's not, it's not without effect. So I think that the morality there is pretty evident. But I actually wanted to mention another play which I thought plays very well into the mission of our institute. Family and marriage, and the play is, of course, An Ideal Husband. Mm. So I remember reading it as a teen, not really liking that much. Then I took it back, skimmed through and then watched the adaptation of a movie, which I think was also very well done. And I realized that, the morality of it, at least to me, there are some passages that seem to me to be speaking of things that maybe we risk underestimating when we present Wilde the way it was presented to you, right? And so if you don't mind, I I just took some passages that I would like to read together.
Sure, I love reading Wilde, yeah.
Do you want to summarize the plot, like,
sure,
for our audience? It's going to be so much better than me.
Yeah. An ideal husband is a, what's it called? When you blackmail somebody, it's a blackmail play where this rich woman comes into the life of a man who's high up in the British government. I think he works in the Foreign Office, which is the International Affairs Office. And she's got this secret letter that shows that he was bribed when he was a young man, which made him his fortune, which allowed him to have his career, which he has. So she is coming in basically saying, like, if you don't do what I want you to do and support this other bill, I'm going to destroy you. And so he starts trying to fight with her over this, and he, at one point he gives in. And anyway, in the end, he doesn't give in. He does the right thing. His friend, Lord Goring, saves him by getting the letter and destroying it. And so they live happily ever after, in the sense that now he and his wife reconcile, because she saw that he had done this bad thing. And she was really
and about this blackmailing moment is, when the wife realizes what happened, is the lines that I wanted to read.
Okay.
Like, it's this moment of, this woman realizing that this ideal husband she had is maybe not that ideal. And I'm glad that we didn't give too many details, because it's worth reading, and it's worth, if you don't have time to read, you can watch it, but I would always suggest reading.
There's a film version too.
So I'm going to read Lady Chiltern as the wife, and then you can be Robert Chiltern. Yeah.
Okay.
No, don't speak. Say nothing. Your voice wakes terrible memories. Memories of things that made me love you. Memories of words that made me love you. Memories that now are horrible to me. And how I worshipped you. You were to me something apart from common life. A thing pure, noble, honest, without stain. The world seemed to me finer because you were in it. And goodness more real because you lived. And now, when I think that I made of a man like you my ideal, the ideal of my life.
There was your mistake. There was your error. The error all women commit. Why can't you women love us, faults and all? Why do you place on us monstrous pedestals? Why do you place us on monstrous pedestals? We all have feet of clay, women as well as men. But when we men love women, we love them knowing their weaknesses, their follies, their imperfections. Love them all the more, it may be, for that reason. It is not the perfect, but the imperfect who have need of love. It is when we are wounded by our own hands, or by the hands of others, that love should come to cure us. Else, what use is love at all? All sins, except the sin against itself, love should forgive. All lives, save loveless lives, true love should pardon. A man's love is like that. It is wider, larger, more human than a woman's. Women think that they are making ideals of men. What they are making of us are false idols merely. You made your false idol of me, and I had not the courage to come down, show you my wounds, tell you my weaknesses. I was afraid that I might lose your love, as I have lost it now. And so last night, you ruined my life for me. Yes, ruined it. What this woman asked of me was nothing compared to what she offered to me. She offered security, peace, stability. The sin of my youth, that I had thought was buried, rose up in front of me, hideous, horrible, with its hands at my throat. I could have killed it forever, sent it back into its tomb, destroyed its record, burned the one witness against me. You prevented me. No one but you know it. And now, what is there before me but public disgrace, ruin, terrible shame, the mockery of the world, a lonely, dishonored life, a lonely, dishonored death, it may be someday. Let women make no more ideals of men. Let them not put them on altars and bow before them, or they may ruin our other lives as completely as you whom I have so wildly loved, have ruined mine.
Yeah, so we can, a lot can be said on these lines. I hope you agree on my choice of picking them. But, okay, there is this idea of like men loving a way, women loving another. I would set that aside, but setting that aside, I think this passage could be read in a in a first way is like in a Machiavellian way, right? So, oh, come on, there's no truth, there's no good husband, there's no good wife, no one is really worthy of love. Just, make peace with the fact that we're all corruptible, and you can read it this way. The way I read it is pretty different, because to me, this is a message of forgiveness. This is a message of true love, right? Like, as Professor Ignaros writes in his latest book, quoting someone else, like, but you will always marry the wrong person, right? Like, there is like no such thing as a woman or a man that will not disappoint you deeply, right? Like, do things that if we don't understand it, we're going to end up in divorce constantly. And so to me, this was speaking of a love that is probably exactly what we talk about when we talk about the love of marriage. Do you think I'm going too far with this, or would you agree that this is a good reading of it?
This is a lesson in forgiveness.
Yeah.
It is, absolutely. Yeah. And it's, well, number one, it did remind me that it's very similar to Dorian Gray, where the guy's trying to destroy his past. But you can't destroy your past. That's one thing. He's failing to face up to his own past. And then the second thing is the forgiveness thing. And he's, frankly, quite cruel to his wife, saying, it's your fault. But, it's both of their faults. But the reality is, people need to forgive, and he's teaching her that lesson. And she does learn it. So in the play, she both forgives him and... because there's a moment where she's saying, okay, I'm going to forgive him, but he's got to quit his job because his career is tainted by this crime that he committed 20 years ago. And the friend Lord Goring, who's the confidant for both of them, says to her, don't make him make that sacrifice. Just because he has this powerful position and he's involved in like a high level of power, don't destroy his career. Okay, people should be punished, but don't unnecessarily punish him and like make him into this kind of self-hating, self-flagellating person. Let him be forgiven and move on. And so she does. And I see this even as, I'm tying it to consumer culture, but any issue of having power in the world, whether it's consumer power or political power, like the power to influence and move things in the world or have wealth, are good things. You shouldn't have to become like a hermit, in order to live a moral life. You need to be involved in the world of hierarchies and power, and in his case, it's political power,
which might involve making mistakes.
Right.
But as you forgive others, no, that's exactly right. I think as you forgive others, you forgive yourself.
Right.
And forgiving yourself, you're okay. Like, you keep the responsibility of your position and of your job. Like, it's that meter that you have with others that is not forgiving and doesn't forgive you, then leads us to paralysis, right? Because there is no, and it's probably it's a sin of pride to even think that you
say so, yeah.
Right, to think that that one could live a flawless life.
A perfectionism. And that's that tends to come up in these plays by Wilde, and these writing, these stories by Wilde. In his other plays, and in fact, even in this play, Lady Chiltern here, I think at some point she's kind of described as a Puritan, and Puritanism is bad. Like a kind of adherence to law and excessive, formality is destructive.
Without forgiveness,
Without forgiveness,
and I want to talk about is joining the church at the end of his life. But another sentence that I found fascinating in talking about, what was love for Wilde, basically, is something that Lord Goring, so Sir Chiltern friend, the one that is going to end up helping him, says, and he's talking to Lady Chiltern, and he says, "No, Lady Chiltern, I'm not a pessimist. Indeed, I'm not sure that I quite know what pessimism really means. All I do know is that life, cannot be understood without much charity, cannot be lived without much charity. It is love, and not German philosophy, that is the true explanation of this word, whatever may be the explanation of the next. So, Wilde 10, German philosophy 0, right? Like, he scored high, but like, is he talking? Could we argue that he's talking about sensual love and pleasure, or is he talking here about using the word charity? Is talking about a love that is the Christian love?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, and it's funny because he mentions the German philosophy thing. I don't think Wilde read Nietzsche directly. Because he wasn't translated yet into English. He had been translated into French. But anyway, but the ideas were in the world. I mean, so like, he would have been familiar with Nietzschean type ideas, and that's why, like, and even in the play, Sir Robert voices a pretty Nietzschean idea, where he says, like when he's first telling Lord Goring, like, I committed this crime like 15 years ago when I was a young man. And I learned, I was the protege of this Baron Arnheim, this Austrian German philosopher type guy, who taught me the philosophy of power. What's at stake in the world? Power. Power over other men. That's what's real in the world. And Lord Goring tells him, what a shallow creed. That's not true. And so, yeah, I think it is a mistake to put Wilde with Nietzsche. I mean, I think they're very different. Also, very different than Marx. I mean, that's to pick on Truman again. I think pairing Wilde both with Nietzsche and with Marx is way off the mark in terms of the core of Wilde's thought.
We don't read about his married life, and we didn't read about the De Profundis, the letter that he wrote from prison, and about his conversion and joining the. So I think that could be a final last topic that we address if you
absolutely
if you like.
Yeah. So to summarize, so he was married. He in 1891, 92, he hits the West End theater and becomes a smash hit. I mean, and this was before the film. So the London theater was kind of like Hollywood in a sense. And so he was fabulously successful working with the most expensive actors and actresses and set designers and all this stuff, speaking of consumer culture. And kind of like a Steven Spielberg for his age. And he did 4 high society plays in succession, which were all big successes. And he had 2 of them running on the West End stage at the time. One was An Ideal Husband. The other one was The Importance of Being Earnest, his 2 most famous plays. When he went to trial for his homosexuality, he was sued by the father of his lover at the time, Lord Alfred Douglas. And so he goes to prison, 2 years hard labor. While that happens, his mother died. His wife died. And my reading of that is maybe they had poor health, but I think they were just completely destroyed by this debacle of their lives. And so Wilde wrote this letter to Lord Alfred Douglas from prison called De Profundis, out of the depths, a quote from the Psalm, out of the depths I cry unto you, O Lord. And the letter kind of does a lot of things, but it has a kind of theory of his philosophy of art, and his philosophy of art has some of the things I was talking about, including this kind of consumer culture thing, but it more specifically gets theological and sees Christ as kind of the, model of art, or the icon of art, how art functions in the human world. So anyway, there's a lot to say in there. So Wilde gets out of prison. He was unable to see. He was forbidden from seeing his children. He had 2 sons. He tried to go to a retreat in England, but was was rejected with the Jesuit order, leaves to go to France. He was disgraced in England, goes to France, and then lives for another couple of years, doesn't write much, and is basically drinking himself to death. And then he dies in the year 1900 in Paris. And on his deathbed, his friend, whose name escapes me at the moment, will come to me, brought a Catholic priest. And it, was this like a last minute thing? I mean, some critics will say like, oh, this is just like Wilde being playful again. Like, it's not serious. He was always like doing things to like make himself look weird. But if you read his life, you see that he had a deep-seated interest in Christianity for a long time. Well, really for his whole life, if you go back. But you see it in Dorian Gray, like we were just talking about. You see this interest in morality and ethics and in Christ. And in his essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, again, Christ kind of comes up centrally. And so on his deathbed, he was received into the Catholic Church and now is buried in Paris in the Catholic cemetery.
Fascinating. Yeah, and I mean, everyone can have, his own opinion about why and what, but I think we all experience that when someone doesn't believe, their rejection of faith is pretty strong. Like you don't have a last minute conversion if you're up against something. So at least that speaks of not that hatred towards Christianity or religion or the idea of an order that is not just the one we create ourselves that probably animated Wilde throughout his life, as we can guess from his works.
Correct, yeah.
So I think that perfect segue to this would be inviting again Professor Truman and inviting again you and having you discuss this further. Because I'm not, I'm no expert in either Nietzsche or Wilde, and I'm just trying to find my way by reading the two of you. And sounds like an interesting. But for our audience, also, like, is there anything you'd recommend as something they could read? I mean, maybe the books we mentioned, like what in particular, if for young students or for anyone who's actually listening that would want to read more.
He's a great writer. Any of his plays, as I said, he died at the age of 45. He died very young. So there's not that many works, actually. But his plays, his one great place to start is his fairy tales. He has a couple of collections of fairy tales, which are very moral, too. I mean, they're like his plays. They kind of play with morality, but really they're are they written for children? I mean, children can read them for the most part. But yeah, his story.
Well, that's something I didn't know about. So I'm gonna look for the fairy tales.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's some great ones. Yeah, I love teaching them.
Very nice. Well, I want to thank you, Paul. And today you're going to be here with us for a little longer. So Dr. Fortunato today is going to be our speaker for the undergraduate fellows. And then we're going to share dinner with the undergraduate fellows or brilliant students and Professor Fortunato. So we'll have this chance to have you a little longer here with us. So I want to thank you again for your time now, for your time this evening. And I want to thank our audience, and please, if you like this episode and if you like this conversation, remember to share it with your friends, to like it, and if you can, of course, if you want to donate to the Austin Institute, that helps us continue with our mission, with our education for the students, and creating this content also for you all, everywhere you are. Thank you again, Paul.
Absolutely. Thank you. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed the episode of our show, What We Can't Not Talk About. If you did like the episode, remember to share it among your friends. Do not forget to subscribe, and if you can, please donate to the Austin Institute. Your donations make it possible for us to continue to do this, but above all, they support our local programming and the important, if not crucial, research of our fellows. Thank you.